The trade war that was supposed to bring Canada to its knees has completely backfired on Donald Trump. And now Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney is playing an entirely different game. Since Trump first threatened those devastating 25% tariffs on Canadian goods back in February, something extraordinary has happened. The Great White North hasn't just survived Trump's economic assault, they've transformed it into the catalyst for the most dramatic political and economic turnaround in Canadian history. And the numbers tell a story that should terrify Trump's administration. Let's start with what Trump thought would happen versus what actually did. When Trump announced those punishing tariffs, citing border security and fentanyl as justification, his administration expected Canada to capitulate quickly. After all, Canada sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States.
By the countries next year. I think what all of this underscores is the importance of the upcoming review of CUSMA. We're doing our consultations for that, as the Americans, as are the Mexicans, and there will be discussions that begin in a few months' time. And our objective is going to be obviously the best deal for Canada, but also to get ourselves in a position where there aren't these specific issues, important issues that are erupting, on an episodic basis, if I can put it that way.
Surely they couldn't survive without American markets. But Trump fundamentally misunderstood both Canadian resolve and their capacity for economic adaptation. Within weeks of the tariff announcement, Canada had not only imposed counter tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, but Canadian consumers began actively boycotting American products on a scale nobody anticipated. The consumer response has been nothing short of remarkable. Products like Florida orange juice and Kentucky bourbon, staples that had dominated Canadian shelves for decades, completely disappeared from stores. Tourism from Canada to the United States plummeted by 34% in August 2025.
U.S. President Donald Trump keeps telling everyone how much he loves tariffs, but it's been a minute since he had new ones to debut. Today, though, he's coming after foreign film industries, including the one in this country, saying he'll slap 100% tariffs on movies made outside of the United States, something Ontario Premier Doug Ford quickly condemned.
Well, I disagree with anything that guy says. He drives me crazy. First of all, we built the movie business up to roughly about $3 billion. Our goal is to build it up to $5 billion. So we're going to continue growing, continue investing in the film industry.
Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, meanwhile, addressed the United Nations this morning, laying out the Carney government's foreign policy priorities in light of a changing world. She spoke with us shortly after delivering her speech. Hi, Minister. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Vashi.
Politico wrote this morning that after being in the room for Donald Trump's speech to the UN last night, that you recast the speech that you delivered this morning, which happened just minutes after Donald Trump announced yet another big round of tariffs. This time, 100%, he says, on movies made outside of the United States. Do you know how that will impact Canada?
Well, first, I just want to correct the record. I have been writing this speech for a number of weeks, and it is a speech that I drafted on my own. So I'm not sure the source of that particular point in this morning's article that you referred to. In terms of our approach on...
Compared to the same month the previous year, for 8 consecutive months, car trips to the U.S. have declined sharply. This isn't just economic data. This represents a fundamental shift in Canadian consumer behavior that threatens billions in American revenue. But here's where it gets really interesting for the advertising world. Canadian media consumption habits started changing in ways that nobody predicted. Viewership on CBC's ad-supported streaming service Gem surged by 34%, especially for Canadian-produced programs like Schitt's Creek and Murdoch Mysteries. This represents a massive shift in advertising dollars from American platforms to Canadian ones, exactly the opposite of what Trump's tariffs were supposed to accomplish. The advertising market tells the real story of how dramatically Canada is pivoting away from American dependence. According to sources AdExchanger spoke with, Canadian advertisers are fundamentally restructuring their media strategies. Some brands are pulling back on ad spend entirely, while others are updating the higher media mixes to invest more heavily in local Canadian publishers. But the most significant change is happening on the creative side, where advertisers have started leaning into national pride messaging as a positive way to reframe everyday Canadians' frustrations. Take Maple Leaf Foods' Look for the Leaf takeover campaign, or Prime Minister Mark Carney's hockey-inspired Elbows Up ads. These aren't just marketing campaigns, they're part of a coordinated cultural shift that's turning Trump's economic pressure into a rallying cry for Canadian independence. The messaging is clear: Canada doesn't need America to thrive, and they're proving it with every dollar they spend. The numbers from major Canadian retailers paint a devastating picture for American exporters. Per Bank, CEO of Canadian supermarket chain Loblaw revealed that sales volume on tariff-marked American items had declined an average of 15% to 20%, with some categories seeing drops as steep as 50%, where Canadian-made alternatives were available. Meanwhile, Loblaw has added more than 100 new Canadian suppliers since the start of the year as consumers actively seek out domestic alternatives. But Trump's biggest miscalculation wasn't economic, it was political. The tariffs and his repeated suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state created a political crisis that completely transformed Canadian politics. When Justin Trudeau announced his resignation in January, the Liberal Party was more than 20 points behind in the polls.
Immediate lens, Carney says he spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump earlier this week in New York, that meeting coming around the same time Washington imposed tariffs on pharmaceutical goods. We're engaged with the U.S. In ongoing discussions on some of those specific strategic areas. Those conversations are ongoing. I had a higher level conversation with the president a few days ago. The latest tariffs would see 100% import taxes on pharmaceutical drugs, along with duties on other kitchen and bathroom items, furniture, and heavy trucks.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre seemed destined for a massive electoral victory. Then Trump's tariffs hit and everything changed. Mark Carney entered the Liberal leadership race and won with nearly 86% of the vote.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has said Prime Minister Carney is jetting around but getting nothing done. Again, the Prime Minister defends his recent trips, including this one to London, a recent trip to Mexico, his time at the UN General Assembly in New York. All things he says are necessary to the end goal of diversifying Canada's partnerships with new countries in the face of that trade war. But now
his message was simple but powerful. Canada would never, ever in any way, shape, or form be part of the United States. In his acceptance speech, Carney tackled Trump's threats head-on, saying, "Donald Trump has put unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed, and we won't." The political transformation was unprecedented. By the time Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister in March, the polling gap had been eliminated entirely, and the Liberals were leading. The scale of their political turnaround was described by analysts as having little precedent in Canadian history.
Budget officer rates his deficits as, quote, very alarming, stupefying, shocking, unsustainable. If you don't change, this is done. Something is going to break. We are at the edge of a cliff. Those are the words of the parliamentary budget officer. When will he stop his out-of-control spending? When he's over the edge of the cliff?
Trump's economic warfare had accidentally created the strongest Canadian government in years, led by someone with the international financial expertise to outmaneuver American economic pressure. Carney's response strategy reveals just how badly Trump miscalculated. Instead of begging for mercy, Canada has launched an aggressive industrial transformation designed to reduce dependence on American markets permanently. The new Major Projects Office, created to fast-track nation-building projects, represents a fundamental shift toward economic sovereignty. Carney announced billions in funding for strategic industries, a Buy Canadian procurement policy for all government spending, and massive investments in domestic alternatives to American suppliers. The advertising implications of this transformation are staggering. A recent study by Canadian media Means Business found that 92% of digital ad dollars had been going to non-Canadian platforms, representing an estimated $7.5 billion in advertising revenue between 2017 and 2025. But Carney's government is actively working to reverse this trend, using everything from regulatory pressure to patriotic messaging to bring advertising dollars back to Canadian platforms. Even more remarkably, some Canadian advertisers are now investing more in the US as a direct result of the tariffs, but not in the way Trump intended. Canada's federal government ran a headline-grabbing campaign in March that targeted digital billboards in Republican-leaning states with anti-tariff messages. These billboard ads, bought and displayed via platforms like .dooh, were designed to pressure American voters in Trump's key constituencies. Canada was literally using American advertising infrastructure to undermine Trump's political support. The geographic and demographic challenges that make Canadian advertising unique have actually become advantages in this new environment. Canada's smaller population of 37 million, spread across vast distances, had always made precise geo-targeting difficult. But this same geographic spread that once frustrated advertisers now provides natural insulation from American economic pressure. Canadian postal zones that were so huge they wasted advertising impressions are now protective barriers that make it easier to build domestic supply chains and reduce American dependence. Canada's privacy laws, which had always made it harder to collect consumer data compared to the US, are now seen as competitive advantages. The Privacy Act from 1983 and the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act from 2000 created a regulatory framework that prioritized consumer protection over data harvesting. In the current environment, where data sovereignty has become a national security issue, these privacy protections are attracting international investment and positioning Canada as a more trustworthy alternative to American tech platforms. The creative advertising response to Trump's tariffs reveals the depth of cultural change happening in Canada. The emphasis on national pride messaging isn't just marketing, it's nation building. Canadian advertisers understand that they're not just selling products. They're helping to construct a new national identity that's explicitly independent of American influence. This represents a fundamental shift from decades of integrated North American marketing strategies to distinctly Canadian approaches. Trump's tariffs have also accelerated trends that were already reshaping the Canadian advertising landscape. The shift toward connected TV advertising, mobile-first strategies, and retail media platforms has been supercharged by the need to reach Canadian consumers through Canadian-owned channels. Traditional dependencies on American advertising technology and platforms are being systematically replaced with domestic alternatives or international partnerships that bypass American control. The most devastating aspect of Trump's strategy failure is that it's created exactly the outcome he claimed to be preventing. Instead of making Canada more dependent on American goodwill, the tariffs have accelerated Canadian diversification efforts that will permanently reduce American economic leverage. Canada has expanded trade relationships with more than 50 countries covering 2/3 of the global economy, creating alternative markets that reduce the strategic importance of American trade.
Wrote this morning that after being in the room for Donald Trump's speech to the UN last night, that you recast the speech that you delivered this morning, which happened just minutes after Donald Trump announced yet another big round of tariffs. This time, 100%, he says, on movies made outside of the United States. Do you know how that will impact Canada?
Well, first, I just want to correct the record. I have been writing this speech for a number of weeks, and it is a speech that I drafted on my own. So I'm not sure the source of that particular point in this morning's article that you referred to. In terms of our approach on any particular tariff measure that the United States is adopting, we are, of course, working for the benefit of the Canadian economy. One of the points in the speech that I made at the UN General Assembly today is, in fact, about our economic resilience at home. Canada is doubling down on our multilateral relationships, not only in defense and security, but also in areas of the economy, such as the WTO. We are forging new economic partnerships with partners. I cited the trade agreement with Indonesia last week.
The advertising data tells the story of this transformation in real time. Canadian advertisers who once automatically included American platforms in their media mix are now actively seeking Canadian alternatives. The 34% surge in CBC Gem viewership isn't just entertainment consumption, it represents advertising inventory that's no longer available to American-owned platforms. Every Canadian consumer who chooses domestic content over American alternatives represents lost revenue for American media companies. Perhaps most importantly, Trump's tariffs have created a template for other American allies, who want to reduce their economic dependence on the United States. The Canadian response, from consumer boycotts to government industrial policy to advertising nationalism, provides a roadmap for countries that want to maintain sovereignty while managing American economic pressure. This could be the beginning of a broader shift away from American-dominated global advertising and media markets. The long-term implications extend far beyond the current trade dispute. Canadian advertising professionals are already discussing how long the Buy Canadian movement might continue, but most agree that the fundamental changes in consumer behavior and business strategy will outlast any eventual trade resolution. The infrastructure being built to support Canadian advertising independence, from domestic streaming platforms to local e-commerce solutions, represents permanent capacity that won't disappear when the trade war ends. Trump's fundamental miscalculation was assuming that economic pressure would create political compliance. Instead, it created political resistance that has made Canada stronger, more independent, and more united than it has been in decades. The advertising market transformation is just one visible indicator of deeper changes that are reshaping the entire Canada-US relationship. As Canadian advertisers continue to shift dollars toward domestic platforms and away from American-owned alternatives, they're not just responding to tariffs, they're participating in the construction of a more sovereign Canadian economy. The creative campaigns celebrating Canadian independence, the investments in domestic media platforms, and the systematic reduction of American technological dependence all represent strategic choices that will define Canadian advertising for decades to come. Trump wanted to use economic warfare to bring Canada to heel. Instead, he accidentally created the strongest, most independent Canadian government in generations, led by someone with the international financial expertise to outmaneuver American pressure at every turn. The advertising transformation is just the beginning of changes that will permanently alter the North American economic landscape. And for Donald Trump, watching Canada thrive despite his best efforts to crush them must be the most humiliating outcome imaginable.